Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, portrays an American dystopia purportedly based on Puritan values, in which women are enslaved to bear children for the ruling class. But what would the actual Puritans have thought of Atwood's horrific Theocracy? Our guest today, Daniel Stein, wrote a book called American Dystopia, in which he demonstrates not only that the Puritans were not misogynistic theocrats, but that many of the values we hold dear as Americans, including individual liberty, find their roots in the Puritans and in their engagement with Jewish sources, including the Hebrew Bible. You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Create a free account at ffoz.org to start exploring the Jewish foundation of your faith and receive a free book from our store.
Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
All the way from Baltimore, Maryland, it's Danny Stein. How's it going, Danny?
Doing well. How's it going?
I'm doing well, thank God. So we have a few things we want to talk about today. You're a yeshiva student, is that right?
Yep.
And for those who watch our podcast regularly, you know, we like to have people who are we like to have all kinds of people on here, but normally they are not far removed from our point of view. We're a Messianic Jewish podcast, and most of the people we have on are followers of Jesus. You are not a follower of Jesus, is that correct?
Yeah, I just grew up as an observant Jew.
We're for that. We're for observant Jews. We're also for Jesus, and that confuses a lot of people. But to avoid any confusion today, we all know where each other stands. We're not going to try to convince you to change your view today. But we want to hear what you have to say about a variety of topics. But so the first thing, let me see if I have this. I have that. I'm going to hold up the book. You wrote a book about the Puritans. Mm-hmm. And that is fascinating already, right? We have a yeshiva student, we have an observant Jew who's writing a book about the Puritans, and I want to dive into that later, and maybe ask you some personal questions about why you took an interest in that topic. But I started thinking, like, who even knows? Like, I was homeschooled, right? I was homeschooled with the Abeka homeschool curriculum, which is a very conservative, traditional values, yay America sort of a thing. And we learned about the Puritans. I don't know if everybody learned about the Puritans. So, and it's, as you point out in your book, when they come up in the discourse, they are not always, they're not always done justice. And some people have done the Puritans dirty. Before we dive into it, I want to talk about who they are, because when you look at the early European who came here for whatever reasons, right? You have Puritans. We have the word pilgrims. There are separatists who are different from Puritans. They came over on the same boat sometimes, but they're a different type of a thing. We have colonists, traders, voyageurs, conquistadores, padres, hacendados, slave traders, and lots of other types of people. And if we're not careful, we can flatten all those people out into the same exact thing happening everywhere, and that's happening a lot with the term settler colonialism, painting every single person with the same brush. So before we start talking about the Puritans, I want you to tell our listeners who they are. Who are the Puritans?
Yeah. The name Puritan itself was actually originally an insult that was applied to this group of people by English Catholics. But it's one of those things that stuck. So the term itself isn't super precise. It can refer to a broad spectrum of people, but essentially the Puritans are a group of Protestants during the English Reformation. So this is 1500s, 1600s. And they're a group that essentially wanted to push the Reformation further. We describe them as Calvinists theologically. A lot of Puritans, or the origin of the Puritan movement, was during the reign of Queen Mary, who was a Catholic and persecuted Protestants. And some Protestants went to Europe, where they went to a city called Geneva in Switzerland, which at that time was run by a Protestant theologian named John Calvin, which is where we get the term Calvinism. And when those people came back under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, that became the origin of the Puritan movement. And the reason they were called the Puritans is because they were dissatisfied with the English church as it stood under Queen Elizabeth. Essentially, theologically, the church was Calvinist, but in terms of the practice, they were still bishops. There were still a lot of vestiges, or as they saw it, vestiges of Catholicism. And the Puritans' goal was to push for the church to be, totally reformed and to get rid of any non-biblical practices. They wanted every aspect of religious worship or practice to be clearly based on the Bible.
Yeah, so Puritans from purify. They wanted to keep going. We're all about continuing the Reformation here at First Fruits of Zion. We think that we can go even further than anyone's gone before and bring back the original Jewish flavor of the early church, even for Gentiles. We want to bring it back. Can you briefly, just for the sake of those who have a historical interest, how were the Puritans different from, for example, right? We learn about Plymouth Rock and all of that, and then we learn about Jamestown, right? I think 1607, the first permanent settlement, a European settlement in the United States, at least from the English. I don't know. There's the Spanish were here before that, but we have so what's the difference between these two groups, the Puritans up in New England and the Jamestown colonists?
Yeah. I mean, the Pilgrims technically are part of that spectrum of Puritans, but the Pilgrims are different than the Puritans in Massachusetts because the Pilgrims, who initially went to Amsterdam, or not to Amsterdam, to Holland, and then came over to the U.S. after that, they were separatists. So they didn't see themselves as part of the established church in England, whereas the Puritans, or maybe the more conventional usage of Puritans, would be for people who came to Massachusetts, and they didn't technically separate themselves from the English church. Their goal was to purify the church from within. So when we refer to Puritans in a conventional sense, I would say that's people like John Winthrop, who became the first governor of Massachusetts, or Oliver Cromwell. Historically, the Puritans are important because there was a civil war in England in the mid-1600s, and there was a Puritan army called the New Model Army, which marched into battle singing psalms and basically overthrew King Charles I, beheaded him. And there was a Puritan Republic in England for 10 years, run by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. In terms of the Jamestown colonists, again, technically all of the English colonists coming to the United States are English Protestants coming out of a Calvinist or Reformed tradition. And by the way, Reformed, Calvin was part of the Reformed tradition, which emerged in Switzerland, but he was so influential that we sometimes call Reformed Christians Calvinists, even though he wasn't necessarily the person who founded that theological branch of Protestantism. But, difference between the Puritans in New England and Jamestown is, for example, things like, the ones in New England came over with their families. They didn't come over as single people. They came over to kind of build a society. They were more philosophical. They had an ideological purpose, whereas some of the colonists who went to Jamestown are more interested in making money or just getting rich, or maybe the typical things you would associate with colonization, like enslaving the natives or finding gold, or getting rich and then going back to England. The Puritans, not only did they have more of a philosophical purpose in coming to the United States, but they also wanted the separation, or what would become the United States. But they also wanted the separation from England. They saw themselves as leaving maybe a society that had been corrupted, and so they compared themselves to Abraham leaving Mesopotamia and coming to the land of Canaan. Maybe the Jews leaving Egypt, or the Israelites leaving Egypt and coming to the land of Canaan in the Exodus. And so they saw Atlantic Sea as the Red Sea, and they saw themselves as intentionally separating from the society back home in order to set up a society that would be more where they would be free to set up something along more godly lines, or as they saw it, something that was a little bit more idealistic.
It's fascinating that they took inspiration from the Israelites, and I want to talk about that more later. I think the last question I have for those who take a historical interest is I never met a Puritan, right? So where did they go, or what of their values and their way of life continues today, or was it absorbed by other groups, or what's their heritage or influence on America? Can you touch on that briefly before we get into the more fun stuff?
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to find a Puritan church today. I don't think there's anyone who has Puritan beliefs or practices. There might be some Calvinist churches, but that's a little bit different. But in some sense, we're all Puritans. If you're someone in America today who believes in, capitalism or personal freedom or women's rights or racial equality, or even the idea of having a classless society where people end up where they end up because of merit, that's all things that we think of as just secular values or just common sense. But those are all ideas that really have a theological foundation with the Puritans. And a lot of what we think of as American values are actually just secularized forms of Puritan values. And just to explain like the relationship between those things, I think if you know anything about the Puritans or about what they believed, you know that they, as Calvinists, they didn't believe in free wills. They believed in predetermination and also something called predestination. And essentially what the Puritans believed is that there's no free will. God, every single thing that happens is directed by God. Just to give an example, again, the governor of Massachusetts, for longtime governor of Massachusetts named John Winthrop, who was he was the initial leader of the colonists who came over in 1630. I think there's a story about him where he found a spider in like a bowl of porridge, and thank God for allowing him to find it, because every little thing was dictated by, everything was kind of controlled by God. And then the flip side of that is something called predestination, where, since the beginning of time and irrespective of an individual's merit, God predestined a small minority of humanity to be saved, whereas the vast majority was predestined to be damned. And you couldn't necessarily know who was part of the elect or who was part of the damned. This was something, it was totally arbitrary. It was up to God. Again, the whole thing is, God's sovereignty, God's in charge. And so if you're coming at, so I guess, starting with that mindset of how, maybe the Puritans were looking at the world, I think you can see the connection between how they were thinking and some values that we got later on. So again, if God's running everything, then, if you're sitting here and you're telling people like what profession they can have or who they can marry or what kind of life they have to live, then essentially you're interfering with God's plan. Whereas, the kind of the implication of Calvinist theology is that what you're supposed to do is let God run the world and kind of leave people alone. And so, in America, we have a pretty strong inclination or a pretty strong foundation in terms of American values is the value of leaving other people alone. Not because, it's not like a means to an end of like greater prosperity. And it's not just like a compromise because you can't control people completely, but just morally, it's important for Americans that we leave people alone and let them, kind of shape their own lives. And I think that's something that, I think you have some transitional figures like Benjamin Franklin, for example. So Benjamin Franklin grew up in a Puritan household. He actually grew up down the street in Boston from the Puritan minister Cotton Mather. He talks about talking to Cotton Mather growing up. There's some stories between Ben Franklin and like his interactions with Cotton Mather. He read Cotton Mather's books. But Ben Franklin he wasn't a Puritan. In Ben Franklin's writings, he talks about, for example, in his autobiography, he has a whole section on like, the 13 virtues and trying to achieve moral perfection. So he tried to, it's famous stuff. You might have learned it in school. I
read that. I bought the Harvard Classics for like $100 on eBay, and I read Ben Franklin's autobiography. It was cool. I loved it.
There you go. And Ben Franklin's also, he was supposed to be a candle maker, I think, growing up, and then he ran away from home, became a printer. So he's someone who kind of, shaped. So those values that he kind of embodies, I mean, maybe he was talking about them in the context of being more successful in this life, but the origin of that approach or that philosophical approach goes back to a specific theological mindset where, I think there's a quote from a Puritan minister named Richard Baxter where he talks about, I think the quote itself is like, he says like an oppressor is an antichrist and an anti-God. And what he meant by that is like someone who's trying to coerce other people. That was something the Puritans were uncomfortable with doing because it's kind of a rebellion against God's role in shaping history or in determining individual's destiny. And then even like within the elect, just to finish on this, and I was kind of going on for a while, but it's an important foundation because it explains a lot about why the Puritans are so important. Even within the elect, there was also a concept of even if you're one of the saved, there's still an individual calling that each person has. So each person still has their own destiny, which you can't necessarily determine. That's something that just kind of manifests itself through their life and something that kind of is directed or shaped by God. So, you kind of see how that's all related to American values. So in some sense, we're all the heirs of the Puritans. We just don't necessarily know it.
Yeah. Any fans out there of individual liberty, whatever your political beliefs might be, if you prefer to just live out the dictates of your own conscience, thank a Puritan.
I guess. Yeah.
So I find it interesting because you talked about with Calvinism the predestination, whereas my understanding, and of course you're going to know better than I do about this, my understanding of the Jewish view is that people have moral agency, right? You have this in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, God tells the Jewish people, hey, look, I'm giving you a choice. You can have blessing or curse. You can have life or death. And he tells them, like, choose life, which implies quite strongly that there is a choice. But what I've heard, and I think this was from like Rabbi Akiva Tatz, um, is that that's only in the realm of moral agency, whereas like with everything else about your life, how much money you're going to make, like when you die, like all this other stuff, like God is like that is all just dependent on God's sovereignty. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, it's Judaism's kind of I think the standard concept is that there's a limited form of free will. But again, Jews today are Puritans. There's very few Christian groups today that would be similar in terms of their beliefs to the Puritans. It's just kind of a peculiar group. Maybe not so peculiar for their. I mean, they were Calvinists. There were other Calvinists at the time, but they were kind of a peculiar group at the time. And so, in order to appreciate in order to appreciate why they're important or what makes them different, you have to get into these details, which like we don't, these kind of beliefs aren't really around anymore. But they had these unusual beliefs, which were very influential.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can recognize what's good and we can have those. I like how the idea of individual liberty. I want that. So the Puritans, you touched on this in your book and in our communications before the interview as we were setting this up. You talk about the Puritans and their engagement with rabbinic sources, their engagement with Jewish ideas, and even taking on like some of the verbiage and things like that. Like, can you talk about that? Like, what elements of their faith and society were drawn from Judaism or drawn from the Hebrew Bible, and why did they? Whence this fascination?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the Reformation as a whole, the Protestant Reformation as a whole is trying to go back to what they saw as the purity of the original church before what they saw as the corruptions of the Catholic Church. So in some sense, they're all trying to go back to the original sources. Instead of reading the Bible in Latin, they're trying to read the Bible in Hebrew. They need Jews or Jewish converts to teach them Hebrew to explain how to read that stuff. But, whereas someone like Martin Luther was a former Catholic monk, someone like John Calvin, who's, a little bit later, Calvin was actually a humanist scholar. So his first book was actually a commentary on the Roman philosopher Seneca, the Stoic philosopher Seneca. And so Calvin approached the Hebrew Bible in the same way that a humanist would approach maybe classical texts in Greek and Latin. I think there's a quote in my book at some point where I talk about how, the Reformation kind of elevated the Jews in the same way that the Renaissance elevated the Greeks and Romans. So it was important to learn Hebrew. It was important to learn the customs to try to figure out what early Christianity looked like to situate it in a Jewish context. And so for Calvin, what made him a little bit different is that, whereas maybe in earlier Christian traditions, you would portray there being some kind of opposition between the Old Testament or the New Testament, or you'd kind of highlight the contrasts or you would maybe approach the Hebrew Bible in the sense that you'd be trying to cherry pick verses to you basically treat it as like a proof text for Christianity and say that it didn't have much significance in its own right. For Calvin, approaching this as like a historian and a scholar, his assumption was that, the text of the Hebrew Bible has its own inherent meaning that can be understood in and of itself without having reference to Christianity or to Jesus, which came later, that it must have meant something to the people at the time. And something Calvin did, he got rid of a lot of Christological interpretations from the Hebrew Bible or stuff that had traditional, from the Psalms, for example. And he basically reapplied those things to the Jews. So they tended to take things that the Bible said about the Jews a lot more seriously, rather than reading them as allegories relating to the church or saying that the Jews had somehow been, replaced or didn't have a role anymore. In terms of the Puritans themselves, they personally, even beyond just being Calvinists, even in contrast with other Calvinists, they really identified with the Jews because they felt like they had some of the same experiences. So kind of like we talked about, like they had the experience of leaving a land that they called home and going, to a new land where they had to set up this new society. So they referred to, in New England, they would refer to where they had come from as like Egypt, and they'd refer to King James I as Pharaoh, and then themselves as like a Christian Israel coming to the New World, which was, a new Canaan. They essentially saw themselves as like reliving this, these like historical events that happened to the Jewish people. And again, like English Protestantism is a pretty broad spectrum. So even in England itself, you had like some pretty extreme Protestant groups that were doing stuff like keeping kosher, keeping the Sabbath on Saturday, or getting circumcisions. Wasn't necessarily the Puritans coming to New England, but you can see like the same mindset. And it's not necessarily because they were trying to imitate Jews or that they were looking at Jews and saying like, oh, how can we be more like these people? I think it was more because their philosophical approach to religion was similar to Judaism. And so they ended up in some of the same places that Jews end up, even if it wasn't intentional. Although, to be fair, John Calvin was reading like commentaries from Rashi, who was a medieval Jewish rabbi, he was reading commentaries from people like, or a lot of the Protestant reformers were reading commentaries from people like the Radak, who's Rabbi David Kimchi, who's important because he talks a lot about Hebrew grammar and he kind of explains how to read the text. So to be fair, they were reading those sources. But even beyond that, I think you can see some parallels in terms of how they approached religion to maybe how some Jews would approach religion. So like the Puritans weren't necessarily trying to make converts. Again, they saw it, God converts. They didn't see themselves as having the power to convert people. So kind of like in Judaism, they saw themselves as this like minority community that kind of separated from society. And, they would they'd welcome converts, but in order to get into a Puritan church, you'd have to prove that you had some kind of conversion experience. It'd have to make sense that you'd have to have some, so it wasn't necessarily, so maybe in terms of that sense, you can see how it's similar to Judaism. Not that Judaism has exactly a concept of an elect, but you can see how their concept of the elect kind of lines up in some way. Because they identified on a personal level with the Jews, they tended to have a lot, tended, not always, but tended to have some more respect for the Jews. Or, so for example, Cotton Mather, or try to fashion themselves in the model of Jews. So Cotton Mather, for example, I think there's an episode where he started wearing a kippah and like calling himself a rabbi. This is in New England. He would quote sayings from the Talmud, or he'd studied Kabbalah. So this was again, not maybe most of them probably hadn't even met Jews, but they were maybe Jews had been expelled from England in the 1290s and weren't readmitted until a Puritan, Oliver Cromwell, readmitted the Jews in the 1660s. Or 1650s. So it was the Puritans who actually brought the Jews back to England. But philosophically, there's a lot of kind of alignment and identification between that they felt between themselves and the Jews.
That's fascinating. All of the flack that we get at First Fruits of Zion for using Jewish sources, and here, like all the Protestant heroes of old were doing it. So think about that, everybody, before you send another email about how upset you are that we use Jewish sources for everything. Someone you love from history is also doing that. Wow, that's fascinating. That's fascinating that they would even know Talmud, because that's a hefty tome to bring on your boat. So, and you touched on this already, that they had a respect for the Jewish people. It makes me think of, we talk about replacement theology a lot, because there's a lot of Christian, a lot of forms, a lot of expressions of Christianity where the theological, like the ecclesiology how in theological terms a church would define itself. Who are we in relation to God, and who are we? How does the Bible talk about or describe our community? And a lot of Christians would say, well, we're Israel. We're the new Israel. And like the Jews were the old Israel, we're the new Israel. And God's done with them, and now he's working through us, or like we've replaced Israel. How would the Puritans have described themselves vis-a-vis Israel, or the term Israel, or the Jewish people? Did they see themselves as a replacement, or as somehow participating in the biblical narrative in a different way?
Yeah, no, not at all. So I think, again, for the Puritans, I think it would have made sense to them that the Jews still have a purpose, and Christians or themselves still have a purpose. You see examples of this. Like, for example, there was a failed Jewish messianic movement in Europe during the 1660s called the Sabbatean movement, which was led by a person named Sabbatai Zevi, who said he was the Messiah. And there was reports of that filtered into Massachusetts. And so Increase Mather, who was Cotton Mather's father, Richard Mather's son, gave a series of sermons. I think it's called The Mystery of Israel's Salvation. So he kind of talks about these ideas. And so, one of the themes, which, this isn't like a unique Puritan theme, but he welcomed the news. Again, for the Puritans, they were reading the promises from like the prophets or from the Hebrew Bible as still applicable to the Jews. It was still part of God's revelation. They were basically taking the text at its word instead of trying to reinterpret it in new ways. Increase Mather talks about how, not only was he predicting that the Jews as a nation would still have a purpose and they would be saved as a nation, they'd go back to Israel, have their own country, but he even makes the point that again, most of the Puritans probably expected that not that they were responsible for converting the Jews, but they probably expected that at some point the Jews would convert to Christianity. But Increased Mather actually makes the point in this series of sermons that like the Bible never says that that's going to happen. It doesn't say when it's going to happen. So he even kind of like he was like trying to predict when that's going to happen or if it's going to happen. Like you just don't know. So what we do know is that there's this promise that Jews still have like a role to serve. For example, there's the Secretary of Parliament during the English Civil War, whose name was Edward Nicholas, published a pamphlet called, I think it's called An Apology for the Honorable Nation of the Jews, basically attributing all of the military conflict and strife that was happening in England in the 1640s. You had like parliamentary armies, royal armies, basically pitted against each other, basically attributing all of that to England's sin in expelling the Jews in 1290 and saying that everything went downhill for their society after they got rid of the Jews, and that what you needed to do was like bring them back and show them honor, show them respect, and that was like a precondition for their own society being blessed. So I think, definitely, Calvinists saw themselves as part of the, they saw they were, whether it was Jews that were part of the elect or themselves that were part of the elect, they saw, God made promises to both. And, they definitely still saw a purpose for both sides. For example, in the Psalms, whereas traditional Christian interpretation had interpreted lines or like vague allusions to people who were like the enemies or the persecutors, whereas previous groups of Christians had attributed that to like the Jews persecuting Jesus, the Puritans were a lot more likely, or the Calvinists were a lot more likely to attribute that or to associate those verses with like the popes or the Catholic Church, whereas the Jews were the Jews. So they kind of read the book, and they tended to see a lot more continuity between the world of the ancient Israelites or the world of the Hebrew Bible and their own world, and the post-Christian world or the post-New Testament world. Rather than seeing them as seeing there's being like some kind of dividing line, and then afterwards the Jews had no purpose. For them it was like both the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament were equally God's revelation. And they both were equally valid. They both were equally valid for all time. It's not like one was just like superseded by the other. They kind of took them both equally seriously. So I think that's how they were approaching it.
Hey, if you're enjoying this conversation, take a moment to like, comment, subscribe, or share with a friend. It really helps us reach more people with the message of the Jewish Jesus and his coming kingdom. You can find more Messianic Jewish teaching and resources from First Fruits of Zion when you visit ffoz.org and create a free account. Thanks. So now that we've said a bunch of nice things about the Puritans, we have because I thought that was important, because I don't want to jump into the discourse. I don't want to jump into the discourse with an uninformed audience. So now we know some really cool facts about the Puritans and some things that we really like about them. So now let's talk about a book by Margaret Atwood. It's called The Handmaid's Tale. It was made into a hit TV series, and it's had a big cultural impact. And people talk about it. People go out there and they dress in costumes from the series to protest certain things that are happening in the world. And so like everybody's heard of it. If people didn't hear of it before the TV series, they've heard of it now. Well, I guess let's start there. We've talked about the Puritans, and now let's talk about the Handmaid's Tale, and then we will talk about them together. So tell us about the Handmaid's Tale. For those who've not engaged with the Handmaid's Tale, what is the Handmaid's Tale?
Yeah, I'd never heard of the Handmaid's Tale until I was assigned it when I was a senior in high school. But it's assigned reading in a lot of schools. There was the TV show. You see them at protests, people dressing like handmaids. But essentially the premise of the Handmaid's Tale is that there's this, it's a futuristic United States where this group of Christian fundamentalists takes over the country, abolishes the Constitution. And they set up a theocracy, which is allegedly based on the book of Genesis. And the reason it's called the Handmaid's Tale is because basically, at least what Margaret Atwood is claiming is like a literal interpretation of the stories of Jacob and Bilhah and Zilpah in the Hebrew Bible, or Abraham and Hagar in the Hebrew Bible. Basically, one of the pieces of their society is they take women and call them handmaids, and the rulers of the society basically, just like use them to produce children, or like basically rape them to have children. Again, in this social society in the book where there's, no freedom of speech, there's no, there's like a thought police, and it's modeled both off of what she claims are literal interpretations of the Bible, and then also modeled off of, like, 20th century totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. Or Margaret Atwood makes comparisons to like the modern Iranian theocracy, or or like, kind of the Taliban or groups like that. But you have to make that relevant to America. So because all these things happened, USSR is in Russia and Nazi Germany was in Germany, and that, Iran is Muslim, not Christian, and, it's in the Middle East. So you have to make that relevant to America. So to make it relevant to America, she says that the Puritans were like these other groups, and that America was basically founded by this group that was like a Christian Taliban that, basically told women they couldn't read or write or own property or have money or like look men in the eye and made them wear veils and dress like in a certain way. And if they didn't, then would, string them up on a wall and execute them for everyone to know. So she's saying that this is like America's original foundation, and that there's this strain of religious thought going back to early American history, which is, I guess deeply flawed or has the potential to create this repressive society, and that it's always there beneath the surface and can come back. And her book is supposed to be a warning about that. But again, all the imagery in the book is Puritan. So, there's like one example. The book itself is set in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where the Puritans set up Harvard College as a religious seminary initially. And there's a scene in the book where, they turn one of the early churches in Massachusetts into a museum, and you can go in the museum and see pictures of Puritans, and that's who they see as like their role models and their ancestors. And I guess in school you read books like 1984 and Brave New World, which are warnings about like communism or totalitarianism. So the Handmaid's Tale is the same kind of thing, except it's a warning about like Americanism and saying there's something flawed about Americanism or American foundations that we have to move away from.
Yeah. And, we have as part of our cultural heritage works like, what's it called? It Couldn't Happen Here, I think it's called. It's so the idea of looking at how things have gone terribly wrong in other places and pontificating how could it go wrong here? Like, that's an interesting question. And even like I remember Ron Paul saying this, made everybody mad. He said, when fascism comes to America, it's going to be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross, right? So it's like, and I remember listening to that and thinking like, well, yeah, it's like whatever the iconography is, it's not going to be borrowed from some other culture. It's going to be homegrown, so to speak. So it's like the premise or the idea. What would American Dystopia look like? That's the title of your book, American Dystopia. Title drop, everybody. What would American Dystopia look like? Like that's a question that's worth asking and worth writing a dystopian work of speculative fiction about. But in your book, you talk about sort of where she went wrong. Like I don't think it's forbidden to ask the question, but the way that she answered it, and maybe people can already have derived the answer to this question based on everything we've already said about the Puritans. But in your own words, why did you feel like you needed to write a book about the Handmaid's Tale and the Puritans? And what are some of the ideas that you felt you really needed to push back on?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're kind of living in a time where there's a lot of historical illiteracy. There's a lot of biblical illiteracy. And so, maybe in the past, people going through school would have learned about the Puritans. And, maybe they also just outside of school would have known something about the Bible. But today, you're not taught much, except maybe you might learn about the Salem witch trials. And then you get to your English class and you're taught a book like The Handmaid's Tale, and and it's taught as if it's an accurate historical representation of what America was like, or it's taught as if it has something to say about the Puritans and what American foundations are. And so that really dictates how you view America or view American foundations. And I'd say there's another problem too. I mean, the book itself, I was writing class assignments and I was kind of pointing this stuff out in class. And then I had enough material in the end where I was able to turn it into a book. I didn't know a ton about the Puritans beforehand, but I knew enough. I knew they had the, revolution in England and like to overthrow a king and set up a republic. And I knew it, Massachusetts, like the portrayal that was being put in the book just didn't make any sense. It was kind of, just seemed completely wrong. And of course, it's the exact opposite of what the Puritans actually were. But I think another thing that really bothered me is also it's kind of a slander of the Hebrew Bible as well. So she's essentially claiming that these, repressive institutions that she's putting in her society, or this like blueprint for oppressing women, which is centered around handmaids and the Handmaid's Tale, is somehow derived. That's like what the Bible is endorsing, or the Genesis is basically like setting out this framework that you could use for that. And I would say also something that struck me as interesting during the book, when I was writing my book, I kind of noticed this, is that, if you look at the Handmaid's Tale closer, for example, the leaders in the Handmaid's Tale, they call themselves sons of Jacob, which is basically the same as, Jews call themselves B'nai Israel, like children of Israel. Israel's a name for Jacob in the Bible. Christians don't really refer to themselves in those terms. If you read The Handmaid's Tale, there's no reference made to Jesus. There's some quotes from the New Testament, but no references to Jesus. So it's like, it's almost in interviews, Margaret Atwood talks about how, I like the New Testament. I like Jesus's message of like kindness and mercy and stuff like that. I don't mean this is like a slander on the New Testament. So essentially what she's implying, maybe not explicitly, she's using a Christian straw man, but what she's essentially implying is that while the society probably wouldn't be acceptable to most Christians, it could be acceptable to Jews, because she's taking everything from Jewish religious texts and saying that this is their literal meaning. This is what they're actually saying. So making comments like that. So I think as someone who came from like a observant Jewish background too, I felt like this had a lot of potential to shape how people view Judaism. And again, I think what Margaret Atwood's doing is not anything new necessarily. The way I put it in perspective is like within early Christianity, there was a debate. This is like the first centuries, 100s, 200s, essentially about like what the status of the Hebrew Bible is within Christianity. And there were groups that wanted to get rid of it. There were groups that wanted to get rid of the Hebrew Bible, and they were saying stuff like, oh, well, this is, it's a different God. It's not like the God of the New Testament. This is a God that's focused on like sex and blood sacrifices and all these disgusting and barbaric things. And Handmaids were one of the examples they pointed to. There's a debate that survives. St. Augustine was originally a Manichaean. He wasn't before he became a church father, he was a Manichaean, which was like a dualist sect, kind of like one of these Christian adjacent groups that was floating around the Roman Empire during that time. And in Manichaeanism, they were a group that rejected the Hebrew Bible. And after Augustine left the Manichaean movement, he had a debate with a Manichaean named Faustus, where they actually talk about handmaids. Faustus is like listing accusations against the Hebrew Bible and lists handmaids as one of the examples. And Augustine was kind of the person who, within the Christian tradition, basically mounted, in City of God, he talks about this, he mounted a defense of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, and talked about why it should remain within Christianity. And essentially, after that, the Hebrew Bible is accepted within Christianity. You've got past these early debates. But once you get to the Enlightenment, a lot of those same ideas resurface. So, for example, there's people like Voltaire, who's famous for being, an Enlightenment figure who was pretty anti-Jewish, anti-Hebrew Bible. But he kind of resurrects these same tropes. If you read Voltaire's writings, he talks about how he has like articles about Bilhah and handmaids, and talks about like, basically portraying the Jews as like this barbaric people, or like the Hebrew Bible is this barbaric document, which, by the way, shaped, a lot of what Voltaire said actually shaped some modern anti-Semitism. So, the way I saw The Handmaid's Tale too is like putting it in that context, maybe not intentionally, but she's also reviving a lot of tropes that have been used against Jews or against the Hebrew Bible. And again, maybe she's not doing that intentionally, but it seems like the same kind of pattern. And those accusations are false. I mean, that's kind of like a twisted reading of what the text is actually saying, which I guess we'll get into. We'll talk about that later. But I also felt like it was important in that sense, as someone who's Jewish, this could shape how people see Jews as well, especially for people who don't know much about the Bible. And this is their only exposure to how to think about the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's unfortunate that so many Christians over so many years in so many works of literature and sermons have allowed this type of thinking in the church, this type of thinking of where, the Hebrew Bible, even the ones like you talked about, the Manichaeans and these dualist sects and these Gnostic people who thought the Old Testament God was like a different God. And that was rejected. But this idea, you still find it around. It's like, oh, the Old Testament, that's, that was then, this is now. And the Old Testament law, that was the preparatory, just a preparatory phase. And it's not really God's final design. And now we have this like a new law based on love and mercy and grace. And it's, by talking this way and by adopting these theological ideas, it was Christians that paved the way for people to read The Handmaid's Tale and think that it's anyway plausible that these ideas are really drawn from the Hebrew Bible in any sort of historically responsible way. But to explain what we're talking about, I think it's always helpful for me to have examples. And the most striking example for me is the title example of The Handmaid, right? Which is portrayed in the book, in The Handmaid's Tale, is like you said, like the most insidious kind of slavery that you can imagine, and we try to make this a family friendly podcast, but for the adults out there who want to imagine a really insidious kind of slavery, it's very dark to be forced to bear someone's children. It's breaks some of our deepest taboos as a society, and for their taboos for good reason, because it's a horrific practice that's depicted in the book. I don't want that to happen. It certainly succeeds as a dystopia, but does it succeed as far as does the role of the handmaid in the fictional society of Gilead in the book, does this practice bear any resemblance to what was going on in ancient Mesopotamia, the setting for the Old Testament stories of the patriarchs? Or does it reflect anything of what the Puritans believed about women and their role in society and how people should be treated and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that handmaid's an English word. It's not a Hebrew word. So you can get the word handmaid from English translations of the Bible. But if you go back to the original Hebrew text, the people that function as what Atwood sees as handmaids, people like Bilhah and Zilpah, who were married to Jacob, or people like Hagar, married to Abraham, they're referred to by different names that have very different meanings. So sometimes they're called like a shifcha or an amah. Those are two Hebrew words for a maidservant. Or sometimes they're referred to as plikshim, which are concubines. Or sometimes they're just referred to as just wives. Isha is the word for wife in Hebrew. So they're referred to terms that basically mean a lot of different things. So we do have this like wealth of archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamia. Essentially, these are documents that come from the same time as the stories that are being talked about in Genesis, as the stories of the patriarchs. So we can figure out what a handmaid is. The Bible itself doesn't go into a lot of detail. So just to start out with the Mesopotamian institution of handmaids, you have stuff like Hammurabi's Code, or we have thousands of actual like marriage contracts between people in ancient Mesopotamia, or court decisions that talk about stuff like handmaids, which again is, it's nothing like what's portrayed in Atwood's book. What is a handmaid in ancient Mesopotamia? It's first of all, it's a matriarchal right. So you're thinking about a society that has polygamy. If a woman couldn't bear a child for a man, then he always had the right to marry someone else. So the point of a handmaid was that the wife would be able to take one of her own slaves and force her husband to have kids with her slave, which again, this also gets into the laws of slavery in Mesopotamia, which is something that, there was slavery in Puritan New England. But, that's a very different legal system. So it's not necessarily the same thing. But the wife had the right essentially to force her husband to have kids with her handmaid. And by doing that, that was a way of like preserving her status within the marriage and ensuring that she wouldn't be displaced by another wife. So this is something that's like a matriarchal right. In terms of like, in the Handmaid's Tale, handmaids are kind of like this caste of women that gets rotated between households. Like, no, it's not the case in ancient Mesopotamia. It's handmaids are just they're female slave. It's a kind of arrangement. It's not an institution. So for simplicity's sake, you could call them handmaids. But what it really looks like is that, essentially all of these arrangements were based on individual agreements between husbands and wives. And it's not really a caste system, so much as it's just like this like practice that turns up and fits within the context of ancient Mesopotamian polygamy and ancient Mesopotamian slavery. By the way, in ancient Mesopotamia, if a handmaid had a child, or even by becoming like, someone that the husband was having children with, she did gain certain rights, which she doesn't have in the Handmaid's Tale. So for example, like handmaids couldn't be like kicked out of the household, or they had, the wife who gave the handmaid to her husband lost certain rights over the handmaid. So, again, you're talking, just even getting back to like what is this institution itself, which the Bible doesn't really talk about, which, it's just kind of like something that's like very different than what she's portraying. But then getting into the Bible itself, I mean, it's kind of, Handmaids in Hammurabi's Code, which, by the way, I do know Hebrew. I also took ancient Akkadian when I was a student at UPenn. So I did read Hammurabi's Code in the original. I'm a little bit rusty now. There's not a lot of opportunities to use Akkadian, but we did read these documents in the original. So by the way, in Hammurabi's Code, handmaids are actually associated with certain idolatrous practices, because there was priestesses in ancient Mesopotamia who weren't allowed to have children, but they could get married. So when one of these priestesses got married to a man, the way they would produce children is she would give him a handmaid. So certainly you wouldn't expect the patriarchs to be endorsing, or the Bible to be endorsing, idolatrous practices. And the ironic thing about, talking about this as like a biblical institution is, well, first of all, it's definitely not biblical in its origins. But really, if you read the Bible and you understand the Mesopotamian context, what you see is that what the Bible is actually talking about is how the patriarchs rejected this practice. And the Bible is describing how it was like dysfunctional and didn't lead to the outcomes it was supposed to, and created all these problems within families. And eventually the patriarchs rejected it. So you get to something like, to start with, like Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. Well, first of all, God never tells Sarah to give her handmaid to Abraham. That's her own idea, which, he does. And then, but in the end, Sarah gets really upset, demands that Abraham kick the handmaid out of the household, demands that Abraham kick the son out of the household, which is kind of a far-fetched thing to demand, because Abraham, it seems like before that, already acknowledged that Ishmael was his heir. So he's essentially kicking the kid out that he already acknowledged was his heir. And he's hesitant to do it because, again, the patriarchs also came from ancient Mesopotamia, so it's not surprising that they had handmaids. They came from Ur-Kasdim, which is probably somewhere in northern Mesopotamia, came to the land of Canaan. It's not surprising that these practices turn up, because that was the cultural background they came from, which is pre-Jewish and pre-Hebrew Bible. There's no Jewish law at that time. Actually, the Talmud, I think, talks about it implies that the patriarchs definitely, you can find examples of where they were engaging in the practices of other nations, because that was like the cultural context they were living in. But essentially, Sarah demands that Abraham kick Hagar out of the household. Abraham's hesitant. He goes to God, and God says, no, listen to your wife, kick her out. So it's essentially a direct rejection or a violation of Mesopotamian law that's portrayed there. So just like the patriarchs kind of reject other aspects of Mesopotamian culture and separate, the word Hebrew means to separate. So Abraham's the first Hebrew. He's someone who starts out as a Mesopotamian, and then because the cultures that he was born into are like immoral or dysfunctional, he gradually separates from those cultures, and handmaids are an example of that. And by the time you get to Jacob and Bilhah and Zilpah, first of all, those people are referred to as wives of Jacob, so it's not even clear that they're functioning as like slaves. But the Bible itself talks about the dysfunction that they introduce into the family. First of all, Rachel chooses, again, not with God, not at God's command. This is her own idea. She chooses to give a handmaid to Jacob because of her jealousy. She's like jealous of her sister. So there's this like rivalry between the different wives. Then there's fighting among the siblings. Again, if you look into, Jewish sources or like rabbinic sources that talk about these stories, they go into a lot of detail about, there's this whole like wealth of Jewish, basically, I guess, like, what do you call it? Like expansions on the rivalries within these families and the problems that handmaids cause. So, for example, with Sarah, there's like a midrashic source that talks about how Sarah was so upset when Hagar became pregnant for the first time that she made her miscarry. So Ishmael was actually her second child. Or, for example, when you get to Jacob and his wives, I think Rashi, who's a medieval French rabbi, he's kind of the authoritative commentary, like the basic authoritative commentary on the text of the Hebrew Bible for Jews, or even for Christians. Even in the Middle Ages, like Catholics were reading Rashi because he was just that important as a commentary. But Rashi talks about how, what was the reason that Joseph got sold into slavery and that his brothers hated him. So Joseph was the son of Rachel, who was one of Jacob's original wives. But what Rashi says is that there was the sons of Leah looked down on the sons of the handmaids because they saw them as inferior. And Joseph befriended the sons of the handmaids. And so they were mad at him because of that. So it introduced all this, these competition within the families. And the rabbinic sources also explain, there's a rabbi named the Or HaChaim, who was a Moroccan rabbi in the 1700s. And he talks about how essentially Abraham actually refused to sleep with Hagar after he realized that Sarah hadn't freed her and that Sarah still thought that Hagar was his slave. And then the Or HaChaim also says that, of course, Or HaChaim says, of course, this practice is, not something you would ever be allowed to do now. Maybe there was some kind of divine providence, or they had some, they were prophets, so maybe there was some reason that it was allowed at the time. But obviously, the Or HaChaim points out that this is not a precedent for later groups of people. And then, you get to the story of Jacob. And by the way, and Ishmael, his descendants end up being the vehicle through which the Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt, because it's Ishmaelite traders that sell Joseph into slavery in Egypt. So it's that turned out pretty badly for, later Jews within the Bible. And then you get to Jacob, and you have rabbinic sources talking about in that case, it was different because there's an Italian rabbi named Tovaggio Sforno, who lived during the 1400s. He talks about how the difference in that case, as opposed to Hagar, is that Rachel and Leah freed the handmaids and made them full wives. And his reasoning for that is, he says they didn't want them to bear the stigma of subservience. And because of that, within Jewish tradition, that's why those children were considered part of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they were basically worthy to be considered as part of like the line of the Jewish people that was descended from the patriarchs. It was because their mothers were freed. So they weren't even handmaids. Genesis is a history of the Jewish people. It's not a legal code for Jews or for Christians, or at least for the Puritans, it was not considered a legal code, and certainly not for Jews. It's not a legal code. And, if you're going to say that handmaids are something that's endorsed by the Bible or somehow is like part of Jewish law or like biblical law, then like, what about stuff like mummification? Like Joseph gets mummified in the Bible, or like, there's stuff like, it's like, is that suddenly like Jewish law all of a sudden that you have to be mummified? Or, these stories are giving examples. They're basically showing that the patriarchs actually lived in these societies that the Bible is talking about. So it's giving examples of stuff that was being done and stuff that like they did, but didn't necessarily mean that was like a precedent for other people, or it was stuff that they came to reject. St. Augustine has a good analogy talking about how, like, if you today go up and decide you want to sacrifice your child, like, okay, just because Abraham was told to do that. And, Augustine talks about this in his, like, I think it's De Doctrina Christiana, his like statement on biblical interpretation. Doesn't mean like you're free from blame or that like it's not a sin if you do it just because like Abraham was told to do it. Again, because what that story is describing is it's not endorsing child sacrifice. It's rejecting child sacrifice. He's told to do that. And then at the last second, God's like, no, don't do that. Don't sacrifice your child. But, even stuff like, Abraham, according to the text of the Bible, marries his half sister, Sarah, or Jacob marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah, or Moses' father, Amram, marries his aunt, Yocheved. Those are all relationships that are forbidden later on in the Bible. If you get to Deuteronomy and Leviticus, those are all relationships that are explicitly forbidden. So, what you're seeing in, so it's like, if you're going to say that like this, like these like handmaids are part of Jewish law, then you also have to say, make the stretch that all those other things are. And handmaids are equally far-fetched because not only, is it, probably just like it's part of the historical background of the patriarchs. But within Jewish law, you're not allowed to have a handmaid because you have to, if you're going to marry a female maidservant or a slave, you have to, by Jewish law, free her first. So there's no way to actually have a handmaid within Judaism. That was something that's like totally impossible. The Mesopotamian system of handmaids is illegal within Judaism. And then obviously Christianity coming out of a Jewish context. If you read church fathers like, St. Ambrose or St. Augustine, I think Ambrose talks about how, he talks about handmaids and says like, well, obviously this was adultery, but like maybe adultery wasn't prohibited before the Bible. That's the only explanation he can come up with. He's like, obviously this isn't like, this isn't like a legitimate relationship, but whatever. Maybe it was pre-Sinai. And then by the time you get to the Puritans, they have their own reasons for being upset with handmaids or for having a critical view of handmaids. And that's that the Puritans are Calvinists, and they believe that they don't believe in free will. They believe that everything is predetermined by God, including things like childbirth. So childbirth is in God's hands. It's God that creates children, not human beings. And so when they read stories, and it's God who chooses who's childless and who's not, that's like God's decree, and you're supposed to accept that because if you're a Puritan, you're supposed to let God run the world. So beginning with John Calvin, actually, in his Bible commentary, when he reads the story of Rachel and her handmaids, I mean, he castigates Rachel and basically says this is like a rebellion against God. They were trying to use these handmaids to get around what, basically God was making it so they couldn't have children, and then they, were trying to like rebel against that and, take this like practice with this immoral practice and like use it to get around that fact. So for example, there's a Puritan Bible commentary by an English Puritan minister named Matthew Poole, where he actually says in his commentary, he says that handmaids are bordering on blasphemy. He called it blasphemy. And Cotton Mather, for example, has a quote where he says that, handmaids trespassed against the laws of marriage. Or William Ames, who was a Puritan minister, I think in England, talks about how, polygamy is contrary to God's institution of marriage because, God created one man and one woman and not, one man and multiple women. So, so the Puritans, not only was the entire tradition going up to them, ever since Judaism, obviously was not, taking handmaids as a precedent, but even the Puritans, even took, went even one step beyond that, and they were like even more harsh against those kinds of things. So again, like taking this ancient Mesopotamian practice that has nothing to do with Judaism, nothing to do with Christianity, was rejected by both Judaism and Christianity, and probably within the text of the Bible itself, and then putting that in a society in America based on a society in New England, which didn't have polygamy and didn't have the same like legal code that, handmaids made sense in the context of ancient Mesopotamia, but transplanting them from Mesopotamia to the modern world or to a Christian world or to like, Puritan society in New England doesn't make any sense because the context, it wouldn't even make sense if a handmaid in those societies because the context isn't even there. But putting it there and then putting it with a group who not only didn't have handmaids, but they wrote Bible commentaries. It's not hard to find what they said. They wrote them in English too, so they're pretty easy to find. They were pretty vocal about what they thought about handmaids. So attributing it to them, to the people who were like rejecting handmaids, doesn't really make a lot of sense. That was the first part of your question. That was super long. I will say that the second part of the question about Puritans and women is also really long. So maybe we should split that up.
Oh boy.
Okay.
Let's take a deep breath.
Yeah.
And if you need to go rewind and listen to it again. I do think I was reminded when you talked about Jacob marrying two sisters, which ends up being forbidden under Torah law. I wonder if it was the Midrash Rabbah or whatever it was I was reading that pointed out that as soon as he got back to the land of Israel, Rachel died. And it was that was the second woman that he had married of the two sisters. So it's almost as if, like, because of the holiness of the land of Israel, it's like, well, you can't be here and be married to two sisters. So the one you married second's got to go. So I thought, wow.
The Puritans actually attributed Rachel's death to the fact that she had given Jacob a handmaid. That was something that they saw as leading to her early death. So they talk about that in their Bible commentaries too. They were like, well, she wanted children so badly, she got children, but she died. That was how they kind of interpreted those stories. So also the whole concept of like, I guess the whole point in the Handmaid's Tale, or, Margaret Atwood's like stereotypical assumption about what religious fundamentalists believe, or about what the Puritans believed, is that like, she assumes that the Puritans thought that if you were a woman and you couldn't have children, then you had no purpose in life and you were a complete failure. And she, that's just her, that's, whatever, kind of a stereotype. There's actually a passage from a sermon given by Cotton Mather to a group of women in Massachusetts. It's called Ornaments for the Daughters of Zion. It's a sermon from 1692. So Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale has a quote that the rulers in her society always use, and it's from the New Testament, from Timothy, I think, and it says that women shall be saved in childbearing. And they constantly quote this. And in The Handmaid's Tale, like if you can't have children, then you're not a woman, you're an unwoman. They call you like an unwoman, and you basically like haven't like fulfilled your role as a woman. So Cotton Mather gave a sermon about this very passage that they're using in The Handmaid's Tale, and basically point by point went through, and he mentions Rachel, and he says like he tells his audience like, don't think that this is saying that if you don't have children, like you can't be saved. He's like, because that's God, God decides that. He's like, don't be like Rachel, who was so upset when she couldn't have children that she was like complaining and she was trying to use a handmaid, and she, she thought that this was like the end, the end of everything. So Cotton Mather in this, sermon to these women says like, no, I mean, like instead it's the fact that everyone has a purpose in life, which is predetermined by God. And so if you can't have children, then that just means that your purpose lies somewhere else. And he interpreted that passage to mean not that women would be saved by having children, because Cotton Mather says like, that's ridiculous. Like the physical act of having children gives you salvation. Like, isn't it being a good person, or isn't it like receiving God's grace and being one of the elect? Like, what does that have to do with like having a child? So he said like, rather it's the fact that childbearing is so dangerous that might inspire someone to have, some, be more focused on like their behavior, or like have a sense of their mortality. But, so again, like she's presenting these things as like, I guess like a stereotyped interpretation of what this traditional religious society in New England would look like, or what she thinks of as this like, New England theocracy. But the Puritans talked about these same Bible passages. And again, if you look at it from like a Puritan perspective, essentially what she's trying to do is take Puritans and put them in the modern world and talk about how they would approach contemporary issues like, the fertility crisis, or like, women not having as many children. And she thinks that they would resort to these like, biblical practices or alleged biblical practices. But, again, so like my book's just about getting in the head of a Puritan and thinking about how they thought. And it's like, like they thought about these things too. It was always, it was always like the opposite. They always were coming to like the opposite conclusions. Their whole philosophy was like the opposite of what she's talking about. It wouldn't make any sense to have these things for them. It's not just that they didn't, it's that they never would have used handmaids.
Yeah, they would be against it.
Yeah, they never like would have cared about those things. That wasn't something they cared. They didn't care about having children. Like it was just all up to God.
Yeah. I thought, here's what I did. I read The Handmaid's Tale because I thought I don't want to come into this discussion utterly uninformed. I hadn't seen the series. I'd never read the book. I'm old enough that I was assigned. Well, was I assigned 1984? I think I just read 1984 because I wanted to. I don't think I was assigned it. I've always liked to read. So I read The Handmaid's Tale. And before I read your book, because like you had read it before you wrote your book, so I thought I would read it before I read your book. And what I was thinking as I read it was the Puritans would have hated these guys. Like the Puritans would have had absolutely no truck with any of what the Gilead people, the fictional rulers of the dystopia of Gilead and the Handmaid's Tale. The Puritans would have not had any truck with any of it. Like they would have found the whole thing abhorrent. Weirdly, I think you can read the book in a very straightforward way, and think, yeah, these guys are just not serious, right? The Gilead people are just not, they're not serious. They're not pious people, right? It's like a joke to them. It's just a way they wrapped their evil, nefarious deeds in this weird looking Puritan type of cloak. And that to me was the most straightforward way to read the book. And it sort of surprised me when I started reading your book and what Margaret Atwood said and what other people have said, the discourse around the book. It actually surprised me that people were taking this seriously as like, oh, this is what real Puritans would do. And it's like, what? Like how did no one learn about the Puritans? No one learned anything about the Puritans. That's really sad. So I think it's I'm glad you wrote the book and you go into so many different categories, and say this is how the Puritans would have felt about this and that. And it's very helpful to clarify all that. One of the chapters you have in the book talks about, you mentioned a few minutes ago, the idea of a theocracy. And I think a lot of people just assume this. The Puritans came over and they wanted to establish, like you said, of kind of a new society. They wanted to look into the Bible and say, how should people organize their life together? And let's start with kind of a blank slate here. And let's try doing that. And people look at that and say, well, it must have been a theocracy. What else would it be? But you talk about this in your book, that wasn't the case at all. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, Margaret Atwood calls it a theocracy, and she says that, she compares it to modern day Iran and says that the Puritans had a society that was run by religious leaders. That is the definition of a theocracy. Again, if you're going by that definition, like actually in Puritan New England, ministers were barred from holding public office. They weren't allowed to be secular magistrates. There was like a separation of church and state in that sense. If you were a magistrate, you couldn't be deposed from your office for some kind of religious offense. So there was no such thing as theocracy. And again, like what was like the point of that? I mean, part of that is coming out of the Puritans' reaction to Catholicism. So they were saying like, well, the reason Catholicism became corrupted is because the popes also had like political power, and so they had the temptations of like ruling people and having money and having resources. And so the goal was not just to protect like civil society from religion, but also to protect like religious institutions and like the purity of religious institutions from basically like the temptations or like corruptions of the outside world. It was actually an accusation. And the Puritans, by the way, in their own time were accused of setting up a theocracy. So there was letters that would come to the Puritans from England. There's one from actually a guy who was a Puritan in England named Lord Say-and-Sell. And he wrote a letter to Massachusetts, I think in 1636, and he accused him of being a theocracy. So one of the ministers in the colony, John Cotton, who was probably the most prominent minister who came over in the initial wave of migration, he wrote a response, and he just pointed out the obvious fact that he was like, look, like I'm a minister, like no ministers serve in the government. You're not allowed to serve in the government. No people who serve in the government are allowed to be ministers. Like we kind of like separated these two things. There's no way that this could be a theocracy. I mean, I would say that like, one of the examples that Margaret Atwood's drawing on is something like, it's like the Salem witch trials. So she talks a lot about the Salem witch trials, and that's something that's referenced in the book. The book was actually dedicated originally to one of her ancestors who was hanged and then cut down and survived as a witch in Massachusetts. So I think that's like a perfect example to look at. Is like, we have these like stereotypes about the Puritans that go back to stuff like the Salem witch trials. What's unique about the Salem witch trials is not the fact that the Puritans had witch trials. I mean, witch trials were happening all across Europe at that time under the auspices of the Inquisition. I think there were something like 50,000 witches burned in a couple of centuries during that same time period. So what was unique about the Puritans wasn't the fact that they had witch trials. And the witch trials that actually took place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, 1693, it lasted for about a year. Actually, maybe a little less than a year. What was unique about that wasn't and they followed a pretty typical European pattern that you can take other examples from Europe and it follows kind of the same pattern. But what was unique was the fact that the Puritans ended witch trials. And so unlike a case like the Inquisition, where people were basically tried before these secret religious tribunals with they didn't know what the evidence was against them. They didn't know who the accusers were against them. It could be anyone. They were just, they were tried, in New England, again, this was also the case in England too. These were trials that happened in like secular courts. They were jury trials there were no ministers that were judging the trials. There were secular magistrates. It was public. Everyone could see what was happening. So within a year, people realized that this was crazy. There was 20 people in the end that were hanged, not burned, hanged as witches in New England. And, in the end, what was unique is that they rejected these trials. And, there was like this outpouring of remorse. So one of the judges, Samuel Sewell, wore sackcloth under his clothes for the rest of his life because of how bad he felt about his role in the trials. A lot of the jurors apologized. They wrote a letter to the victims apologizing for what they had done. Some of the witnesses apologized. Again, if you're trying to talk about, the Puritans as like misogynists, it's like, well, and one of the examples I would point to is the Salem witch trials, because she was like, well, most of them were women who got killed. And then there were some men, including some prominent men. Actually, one of the former minister of Salem, George Burroughs, was killed as a witch during the Salem witch trials. But,
wow.
But so she's taking that as an example of misogyny. Well, actually, all the testimony in the Salem witch trials came from like young girls who were given all this power suddenly to accuse people of being witches. So I don't know if that's such a great example of misogyny. By the way, in the Handmaid's Tale, women aren't allowed to give testimony in court. So not only were the Puritans allowing that, but they were allowing these like young girls who, it wasn't even like adults to, like 11 years old or 9 years old to accuse people of being witches. But, in the aftermath of Salem witch trials, they basically gave reparations to the families. The government passed resolutions condemning the trials for decades after that. Some of the initial children who had accused people of being witches later apologized. There was sermons that were given. They were saying that there was like a blot or like a stain on the land because of the sin of the Salem witch trials that were given out, in the aftermath. So the reason we remember the Puritans as witch hunters is because they essentially publicized their own shortcomings, which no one else did. And they publicly apologized for what they had done, which no one in Europe did. There's quotes from people in the Inquisition. Like, I think there's one from the 1550s where there's an inquisitor talking about how they had burned like 30,000 people as witches. And he's like, and if we hadn't done that, then all of Europe would have been destroyed. The world would be destroyed. There was never a doubt in their minds that they had accurately identified people as witches and that what they were doing was like, whereas the Puritans had a lot more humility because again, for them, it was like, they didn't think they could judge the supernatural. So just like you couldn't tell who like one of the elect was, you couldn't tell who God had selected to be one of the saved. You also, same thing too, like, how could you tell? Like maybe this person who's being accused, maybe they're innocent. Maybe it's just like, the devil who's like trying to get, get us to make a mistake. So the Puritans had like a lot more humility when it came to those things. When it comes to the Puritans as like authoritarians, their whole psychology was, they weren't like confident people who were willing to like impose their values on other people. They were deeply like insecure and unconfident people. The whole point of being a Puritan is you were constantly trying to find reassurance that you were one of the elect. And so Puritan ministers like Cotton Mather, Thomas Shepard, they would sit like for hours every day in their studies, basically like, praying to God, begging God to give them some kind of revelation to prove that they're one of the elect. They were deeply insecure people. They were always open to new insights or like new ideas. So the whole idea that they had this like authoritarian personality, it's not even like the personality of this group. I guess just to talk more about the theocracy aspect, another thing that Margaret Atwood talks about a lot is it's like persecution of religious dissenters. And they had
the Quakers,
it's the Quakers, which you expect that to happen in a theocracy, and in the Handmaid's Tale, there's stuff like sectarian roundups where they capture Quakers and Baptists and all these were Catholics and they execute them or they torture them and they torture them until they convert. They basically they forcibly convert them. First thing to point out is like, there was persecution in New England. I mean, by the way, everyone was persecuting at that time, so that's not necessarily unique. Did it look like anything in the Handmaid's Tale? I mean, the Puritans didn't think they could convert people. They weren't forcibly converting anyone. Their only goal, I mean, they had left England to come to New England to set up their own society in peace, to be left alone by other people. So all they cared about was getting other people to leave them alone. When there were cases of religious persecution, essentially all they did was kick them out of the colony. And then there was 4 Quakers who was hanged. That was after coming back multiple times. And again, Margaret Atwood's thinking about Quakers like today. So the Puritans weren't really persecuting Quakers as a religious threat. And in England, the Anglican Church wasn't persecuting Quakers as a religious threat. The original Quakers were being persecuted because they were a public nuisance or a public disturbance. So for example, in New England, there was cases where, like, I think there was a case in Newbury where a lady named Lydia Wardwell, who was a Quaker, like ran into church naked, like screaming about how, all the people there were going to be burned or, condemned. Or there was, a guy walked into a church, like breaking glass bottles and saying that God was going to break you, like I'm breaking these glass bottles. Or there's someone who ran through the streets, like yelling, like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and then tried to like stab, there was stuff like that where, like, the Quakers are people who got this like crazy inspiration that could do all these like crazy things. So it wasn't really for religious reasons. I mean, even Roger Williams, who was expelled from the colony of Massachusetts for religious reasons, not a Quaker, and founded the colony of Rhode Island. He even has like a writing from, I think, the 1670s where he talks about how it's legitimate to persecute the Quakers because it's not a religious thing. They're just like, I think he calls them like barbarians who are kind of like undermining civilized society. But even with that,
even Roger Williams, famously wrote the bloody tenet of persecution for cause of conscience. Even Roger Williams was okay with persecuting the Quakers. Wow, they must have really been ticking people off.
Just to make the point that this wasn't like a religious thing. They weren't like, Oliver Cromwell in England was famous for actually releasing the Quakers from prison. So this Puritan leader of England was actually the one who like made treatment a lot better for Quakers. So, they didn't have any like, weren't trying to exterminate the Quakers or eradicate them or anything like that. Again, because there was a separation of church and state, you couldn't be kicked out of the New England colony unless you broke an actual like civil law, like unless you caused a public disturbance. So in the end, what that meant is that, a minister couldn't be persecuted in Massachusetts for being a heretic. And the ministers in the colony didn't even have power over a lot of people because, again, you couldn't be in a Puritan church unless you proved that you were, you had some kind of conversion experience, that you were a member of the elect. You had to be voted in by the congregation. By the way, the ministers were voted to their position by the congregation too. So it's all based on like, voluntary like consent and elections. But, no church had authority over other churches. That's also part of like the legal system in Massachusetts. So, in the end, like, essentially if you were peaceful, the Puritans didn't care about your religious beliefs. There was Baptist churches in Massachusetts pretty quickly, I think starting in the 1660s. Anglican churches popped up there. They weren't persecuted. That stuff ended pretty quickly. Cotton Mather actually apologized to Quakers and talked about how much, how horrible it was that this persecution had happened. At a time when there was still a lot of religious persecution going on in Europe, and it was actually getting worse, not better. Just kind of the idea that there was like this like theocracy in New England. The only place in the laws in Massachusetts where you could point to a biblical precedent that they were taking from is the capital punishments. So all of the capital punishments, like, execution in New England, were all based on passages from the Bible. What did that mean? Or what does that reflect about the Puritans? Well, I think what it reflects about them is the fact that they saw, God creates life, and they were very uncomfortable with taking life unless there was a direct mandate from God to do something like that. So the consequence of what they were doing is that whereas in England, there were about 50 capital offenses that you could be killed for, in New England, it was 15. They reduced it to 15 because they based it only on examples in the Bible where you could, clearly show that was a capital punishment. I think in England itself, the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell tried to get rid of capital punishment, except for like murder, except maybe for murder. The whole concept that this was, some kind of the ministers were running the colony. They had no, there was no, political power. The government might have asked the ministers for advice, but again, that's no different than, like a president going to like someone today and asking them for advice. It's not that they necessarily had to listen. It doesn't mean they were running the colony. So
no, it's so, and this is the Handmaid thing and the Theocracy thing. These are two of the chapters in your lengthy book, American Dystopia. And so that's a little preview for all of you out there, and you can go buy the book and you can read about you can read many more examples of how the Puritans are given short shrift in what has become a culturally influential book. I wanted to ask about the potential cultural impact, which you touched on before, when the patriarchs and other biblical figures, particularly those in the Hebrew Bible, are portrayed as amoral or barbaric, and like, I mean, it's kind of interesting because Maimonides is like, animal sacrifices. That was we're not sure about that anymore. Like he's a philosopher, right? So he's thinking about this stuff, and but there's difference that's different from what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who are looking at these guys and thinking like these patriarchs are just like bad, like amoral people, barbaric people. Does that spill over onto the rest of us? Does that spill over onto Jewish people who or to Christians, people who value the biblical text and are trying to pattern their lives after the Bible heroes? And like, what can we do about that? Like, what can we do to push back on this in a way that does justice to all of the historical facts?
Like we were talking about, I mean, we're living in a time with a lot of biblical illiteracy. So I think this has a couple of consequences. And one is that for religious people, it might make them a little bit more defensive. The fact that this Handmaid's Tale, these kinds of ideas shape how people view the patriarchs or view religious texts. And so it might make religious people a little more hesitant or defensive about, talking about religious values in public, or, so I think it has one effect in that sense. And I think the other sense is that, the patriarchs, they really are the foundation of Western civilization. I mean, you go back to Genesis, I mean, that is the foundation of everything. I mean, everything in Europe, everything in America, it all goes back to these texts. And so when suddenly those people become the bad guys, you've kind of just like unmoored society from like its foundation, like our society from its foundation. And I think what you're seeing today is like that just kind of leads to chaos. Like once we don't have that like common purpose or that common heritage or common assumptions, that can lead to chaos and people going off in all kinds of directions and not really having like a sense of direction. I'm doing my part. I hope to, explain to people the, kind of the reality behind this stuff. I mean, it's not a, we're just kind of living in a time period where people don't necessarily know these things. And so I think the most important thing is just to explain it to them. It's just history, just history or, but yeah, hopefully more people do the same, and hopefully people read the book. That'd be great. Hopefully more books like this will be written. But I think it's super important. It's beyond just it's beyond just The Handmaid's Tale or attacking Margaret Atwood. Or I'm not attacking Margaret Atwood. I have nothing against Margaret Atwood. It's nothing to do with that. It's more about like, understanding like, our foundations as Americans and as people living in the West.
Yeah. I've noticed that there's sort of a kill your heroes approach going on, where it's like for a long time we hagiographize these people. I mean, I've been to the United States Capitol. I've seen the Assumption of George Washington up into heaven with the angels on the inside of that dome. And so it's like these people could do no wrong. And now the pendulum seems to have swung the other way. And it's like, these people were terrible and they did nothing right. And, I appreciated one of the things I appreciate about your book. And I think we need to do is, first of all, let's just actually read what they did and wrote. Like you said, we're all illiterate. Like we were not, who's reading, usually a yeshiva student reading Cotton Mather and St. Ambrose and St. Augustine and knows more about Christian history than 99.9% of American Christians. So that's an indictment right there. But yes, to actually read what happened and read what these people did and wrote and assess them, even-handedly. Were they perfect saints? No. Were they evil monsters? No. Read about them in their time, in their context.
But I will say, though, that I think one of the things that you get from my book, or one of the underlying themes, is that all the things that Margaret Atwood appreciates about America today, like gender equality or racial equality or personal freedom, all those values that she thinks of as American values and appreciates, she attributes them to like the founding generation and thinks that the founding generation was, in opposition to the Puritans somehow. Doesn't make a ton of, I mean, it's like Ben Franklin, whatever. It's like more continuity than opposition. But yeah. It's like all of those things are really like, actually all those values that she appreciates really come from the Puritans. So she's essentially attacking her own intellectual ancestors. There's a story about a rabbi. I don't remember which one, but it's a famous story. It gets repeated all the time. But there was a rabbi on a plane maybe going to Israel or something, and there was a secular Jew next to him, and during the entire flight, this rabbi's children kept coming up to him and like asking him what he needed, and like bringing him things and like taking care of him. And this secular guy's kids were also on the flight, and they weren't doing that. And so he turns to the rabbi and he asks him, like what, like why? Like you must have done a really good job raising your children. Like why? Like why are they treating you so differently than like my children never treat me like this? And the answer that the rabbi gives him is, well, you teach your children that they're one more generation removed from the apes than you. And then I teach my children that they're one more generation removed from Mount Sinai. So I'm one more generation closer to Mount Sinai. And so it's like, it's the same thing I think with the patriarchs. It's like, how do we portray our past? Like, is it something to like run, get away from? Is it, going back to the patriarchs? Like, are we one generation removed from these like horrible people? Or are we like one generation closer to these people that basically set the foundation for a lot of things that we can appreciate? And when you remove the foundation, you have to know what you're getting rid of. And you might be getting rid of a lot more than you think, because a lot of the things that we take is just common sense assumptions about how we view the world, the philosophical framework that this isn't a partisan thing. Like most people tend to view the world. It's like a lot of that really has an actual historical foundation and has a foundation in like an actual tradition. And once you get rid of the tradition, you have no idea what it could be replaced by. So you could end up in a place that you really, you wouldn't be happy about, or don't even attend or don't want. So.
Yeah, something will fill the vacuum, and it may not be
exactly.
It may not be what is expected. I think one of the people that's trying to fill the vacuum, and maybe you haven't had it, maybe you have, and you can just say this if you haven't. Maybe you haven't had any exposure to these people. But the one time in my life where I felt like Margaret Atwood might have been onto something was when I went to a Right Response conference down in Texas. It seems like it was a few years ago, and guy named Eric Kahn got up there, and what I took away from his talk was that women should not have not be part of public life. Women working in the workplace are responsible for all the problems that men experience, and he also blamed Jews for that. He blamed Jews and feminists for pretty much everything. Now they're not saying the Puritans were like this. They're not dressing up as Puritans or anything like that. They like the Crusaders, but listening to this, I thought, well, there's someone out there who wants to do something crazy. Have you experienced any of this? Like, how do you feel about that?
I wouldn't say I personally experienced any of that. I don't really, but I would say, I'm not Christian. I'm not really in a position to give an opinion on what's like authoritative Christianity. So maybe they're right, maybe they're not. I don't know. I'm more just like I'm more just looking at it from a historical perspective. So I'd say the only thing I'd say to people like that is that, at least in like an American context, like starting with the Puritans, what they're saying is not the traditional position. It's like the innovative position. So they're like the innovators, and really the tradition is like, it's not really, so just from my perspective, as like someone who studied the Puritans, that's kind of like out of line with what the tradition in America has been. So maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. I'm not sure in terms of like what, if you're going to try to talk about like what is authentic Christianity, like what are authentic Christian beliefs, but at least in like a historical context, talking about America, like that's not the way that those things have been approached in America. That's not really the foundation. I think the problem with the Handmaid's Tale is it actually in some ways gives those people some kind of legitimacy, because it's saying that they have a point. It's saying that this actually is the I don't think Margaret Atwood's intending this. I mean, she's intending to say that this is the foundation of the country. I don't think she thinks about this implication of what she's saying, but it's essentially saying that like this is really what the foundation of the country was. And so when these people get up there and say things which come off sometimes as you're talking about, they seem kind of extreme to you, or they they give those kinds of positions. It's books like The Handmaid's Tale that make it seem like they actually have a point and say that like what they're saying is not new and that it has some kind of tradition in the United States. But the reality is there is no tradition for what they're saying. It's at least in this context in America, and historically it was the it was the exact opposite. So that would be my perspective on that, just having written this book. Which again, there's unintended consequences for how you portray things in the past. So I think that's, by the way, like I'd say the book I wrote is not just for people who it's like a lot of people who obviously big fans of The Handmaid's Tale or kind of take it like the message that Atwood wants them to get out of it. But I'd say I've also encountered articles from it looks like Christian sources where they talk about how like this seems like a pretty good society, like Like they also buy, Atwood's drawing on stereotypes, and those stereotypes are shared by everyone. So it could even be shared by people who might like those stereotypes and might think that looks like a good society, and they might not know enough. Where if they read a book like The Handmaid's Tale, they might say like, oh, well, this really is what America was initially like. So there you go. So so again, so I'm not saying whether any one side's right or one side's wrong, but just pointing out like from a historical perspective, that's not really the case. And I think her book has unintended consequences in multiple dimensions, not just the one that maybe she was thinking of when she was writing it.
Well said. Well said. So I have a final question, and you can spend as much time on this as you want. I think there will be many, and I'm among them, and our associate producer Hope is among them, who are impressed and fascinated that a yeshiva student, an observant Jew, has taken such an interest in the Puritans and in Christian history that again you're so much more knowledgeable than the average Christian or even most educated Christians. Where did this interest come from, and what sparked it, and maybe like did anything surprise you as you started reading about Christians? What's been your impression or perspective?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say that, for me, obviously being Jewish, I'm very appreciative for America. And America has been a really special country, both for Jews and for a lot of other people. It's been a really great place and kind of a unique place historically. But I think I realized that in order to understand where American values come from, you have to understand the theological ideas that the Christian groups who founded the country had. And so it's impossible to understand American values or that context, or like what's made America such a great place for Jews, or what's made America such a great place for other people as well, without understanding that context. So I think that was really my path to being interested in that. And obviously, once you go through that perspective, like, who were the Puritans reading? St. Augustine. So you have to go back to St. Augustine and like read like church fathers. And so I would say that was kind of my path to being interested in that. And I would say the thing that surprised me the most, which we talked about a little bit earlier, was at least in the case of the Puritans, like how like Judaic in a lot of ways they were. So and again, in some cases they knew things about Jews, or they were reading Jewish documents, and so when they say they quote the Talmud or they quote the Jewish source, that's interesting. But I think in some ways too, which we mentioned earlier, it's also like their philosophy to approaching religion was in some ways similar to Judaism, which I didn't necessarily appreciate before. And so sometimes you read something the Puritans were saying, and it sounds like a very like Jewish idea in some cases, not because they were necessarily taking that from a Jewish source, but just because their like approach to their approach to their philosophy was kind of similar in some ways. So I'd say that was the most surprising or like interesting thing to me, was talking about the relationship between, there was ideas in their writings that I seem to recognize when I read them, and that was interesting. Not everything, but there were some ideas where it just seemed like you could draw parallels, and I'd say that was probably the thing that was the most fascinating to me, it being able to combine those two realms.
Yeah, there was the Reformation birthed this whole phenomenon of like Christian Hebraists, Franz Delitzsch, and you have Lightfoot's commentary on the Gospels from the Talmud, and you have Strack and Billerbeck wrote a commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud and Midrash, and all these people are suddenly like starting to get it, and they're connecting these dots and saying, "Wow, this looks like Jewish literature. The New Testament it's like, look at all the connections and all of the common heritage." And
one example, like you were saying, which I thought was pretty cool, is there's one of the early reformers named Paul Fagius translated the Jewish or the Hebrew grace after meals into Latin. And like, why was he doing that? It's not necessarily because he was interested in what contemporary Jews were doing, but the whole goal was like, well, what were the early Christians doing? Like, they were trying to recover this, like, what they were trying to recover by doing stuff like that was trying to figure out, like, the kind of like life or practices that early Christians would have had or Jesus would have had. So when it came to translating documents like that, they were just so I think that was like a pretty cool example of like, not something you'd expect to be looked at by like, Protestant reformers, but that was something that actually got translated into Latin and people were reading, not because they were trying to understand contemporary Jews, but as a way of understanding themselves as Christians.
Wow. That's fascinating. So all the pushback that Messianic Judaism gets from the Christian side about why you have so much to do with the Hebrew Bible and with Jewish texts and stuff. What we learned today, I think, is that all those people hate America. So
Okay. All right.
I kid. I kid, of course. So, well, we're out of time. But before we sign off here, do you have how can people follow you on social media and do you keep track of where your career is going? Because I have a feeling that it's going somewhere.
Thank you. I actually don't have any social media. I have a sub. I have a Substack. So there's a Substack people can subscribe to. It's called the Collected Papers of Daniel Stein. But I put things like I have like book reviews on there. I'll have Dvar Torahs, so like biblical sermons, occasionally different historical essays. So they're all not all about the topics related to anything about the Puritans or Reformation or anything like this, but all kinds of things. So I would say that's probably the best way. Books available on Amazon. So there's always that.
We'll hold it up again so you can recognize the cover. It's called American Dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale in Puritan History. Our guest has been Daniel Stein. Thanks for coming. It was a great conversation. We're honored to have you.
Thank you for having me. It was awesome. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us today on First Fruits of Zion's Messiah podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review along with a 5-star rating. If you want to learn more about the Jewish Jesus, create a free account at ffoz.org and start studying the scriptures from a Messianic Jewish perspective. We'll even give you a free book. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who partner in our mission to reconcile disciples of Yeshua with God's prophetic promises to Israel. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee. Let his word cover you.